Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to
Finski političar, autor i komentator, maratonac i triatlonac, bivši ministar finansija, ministar vanjskih poslova i donedavno premijer Finske. Među najglasnijim je zagovornicima jačanja NATO-a i naoružavanja Ukrajine u borbi protiv Rusije.
So, Mr. Stubb, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. Now, many years have passed since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Finland has been managing to play a great balancing act in its relations between Russia, the EU, and the United States. This year, Finland decided to join NATO. You were one of the earliest proponents of joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Has Finland lost precious time?
No, not at all. And to be quite honest, I think we've been part of a football team called the European Union. So in that sense, it hasn't really been a balancing act. And that European Union has tried to nurture a good relationship with the United States and a good relationship with Russia. What we did in 1995 when we joined the EU was to realize that it wasn't possible to join NATO at the same time. So we integrated our military and our military equipment as closely to the United States and NATO as possible. So if one day there would be a rainy day, we would be so compatible with NATO membership that it could happen and take place overnight. And of course, with the wisdom of hindsight, it was the right thing to do. We are ready for NATO and NATO is ready for us.
Mm-hmm. But you said it wasn't possible at one time to join NATO back in 1995. Why wasn't it so?
Public opinion, basically,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess political leadership to a certain extent. And,
yeah.
you know, in a democracy, quite often you are in a situation whereby if there is not overwhelming public support, it's very difficult to drive, for instance, membership. So pretty constantly, we've been 50% against and 20% in favor of NATO membership. But that changed overnight on the 24th of February this year when Russia attacked Ukraine.
Right, and now public opinion is overwhelmingly in support of joining the alliance. But I want to move on to another thing. Since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February this year, Turkey has remained the friendliest of all NATO member states towards Moscow. It has not imposed sanctions or canceled flights between the two countries and has continued to cooperate closely with Moscow on many different issues. What are your views of Turkey's relations with Russia and Turkey's conditioning of Finland's NATO accession?
Well, I think those are pretty much two separate issues. I mean, the first one is basically linked to the fact that Turkey wants to play some kind of a mediator. I remember being foreign minister and actually setting up the Friends of Peace mediation together with then Foreign Minister of Turkey, Ahmet Davutoglu. We're talking like 2010, 2011, something around those years. Now, the separate issue then is Finnish NATO membership and ratification. And to be honest, I don't think that Turkey really sees any issues with Finnish membership. It's a little bit more related actually to Swedish membership and Kurds. But I'm quite convinced that these types of issues will be ironed out sooner rather than later.
Mm-hmm. Now, since invading Ukraine, Russia has made no shortage of blunders, but perhaps its biggest blunder must have been underestimating Ukraine's willingness and ability to fight, as well as the West's support for Ukraine. Do you think Ukraine can count on long-term EU and US support in its fight against Russia?
Definitely. I think what Russia did was a classic mistake of mixing tactique with strategy. And that's why things have gone so horribly wrong, especially for President Putin. I mean, look, what did he try to do and what did he achieve? He tried to destroy Ukraine and make it Russian. Well, it became European and it'll become an EU member and probably a NATO member at some stage. It tried to split the European Union. I've never seen it more united. It tried to split NATO. It came back with a new purpose from its origin from 1948. In other words, a repellent to then Soviet aggression, now Russian aggression. It tried to split the transatlantic partnership. We're back to where we were in the Cold War. And then the icing on the cake, of course, is that Finland and Sweden will join NATO. But I'll add one more point. I think Europe is split into two. On one side of the fence is Russia, and on the other side of the fence, you have 44 states, actually including Armenia and Azerbaijan. So things have gone horribly wrong for Russia, and I think Ukraine can count on Western support until Ukraine wins this war and kicks Russia out of the annexed regions and the Crimean Peninsula.
Right, Professor, but what if the Republicans gain a majority in the midterms in the US, which is quite soon? Some high-ranking Republican officials have already stated their reservation towards sending huge military packages and military assistance to Ukraine.
Well, you know, elections come and go, but in the United States, there's one thing for which there is cross-party support, and that is that the number one enemy of the United States is China. Now, if, of course, then the Republicans want to play into the hands of China, that's when you make sure that Russia gains an upper hand on Ukraine. So there are so many interlinked issues here. So after the elections, we will see, I think, the Republicans falling into line, or at least there being bipartisan consensus that Russia needs to be defeated and Ukraine needs to win this war. Otherwise, China will come out on top in this conflict.
Would that be the worst case scenario of having an empowered China in the world?
Not really. I mean, I think the balance of power is shifting in the world. And what we're seeing happening right now is that you have a multipolar world. I think the interesting fact is that China is actually making Russia into its vassal state. So creating path dependencies, as it always does, with sort of lukewarm support. China is much, much bigger than Russia, but I think the three biggest powers at the moment and for the foreseeable future are the United States, the European Union, and China. And it is this balance of power that we're all trying to understand and deal with.
So you wouldn't even include Russia as a major global power? Would you
no,
think
not at all. I mean, you have to understand that the size of the Russian economy is less than 2% of world GDP.
It's the size of Spain's economy.
Well, something around there, the Dutch economy. And on top of that, we can see that the Russian military is not only weak, but it's incompetent. And the final sort of, how would I say, stronghold that it had was energy dependency, and we're waning ourselves off of Russian gas. So, Russia is a power in decline, and these are sort of the last spasms of that power in trying to claim that it's some kind of a big global player, when, as a matter of fact, it's not. I guess it's the curse of a petrol economy.
Now, you mentioned the Russian military. I mean, the once daunting Russian army's grievous losses in Ukraine have somehow showcased its and revealed its true state. What did many military analysts get wrong in this? I mean, why is it that they overestimated Russia's true military potential?
To a certain extent, yes. I mean, we saw some of that already in the war in Georgia in 2008. I had the opportunity as foreign minister and chairman of the OSCE to mediate peace in that particular conflict. And we saw then already that the Russian military wasn't that strong, but we thought that after that, it started to build it up. But I guess one of the main problems is that no matter how much money you pour into the system, if the system is corrupt, weakness comes to the front. And that's what we've seen, for instance, with Russian intelligence and capacity on the ground. It has been mind-bogglingly weak. And I don't think many of us understood how weak it is. This doesn't mean that Russia is in danger. It always will be. But fortunately, it is very weak at the same time.
Right, but if you bear in mind that Vladimir Putin has, especially since the conflict in Georgia, invested substantial amounts of money in modernizing Russia's armed forces. What went wrong? I mean, has this money been siphoned off by corrupt Russian generals?
Partially, yes. I mean, we've seen, for instance, information about the corrupt sales of intelligence equipment. We've also seen that a lot of the investment into modern weaponry and tanks and armaments haven't exactly gone into waste, but they have been destroyed and they've had to start using their old equipment. Again, you top this off with a circumscription or mobilization of regular Russian men to help out in the war situation, and that gives you a rather grim picture of the state of the Russian military at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Now, President Vladimir Putin has been in power for over 20 years. In order to survive, he has managed to tame ambitious generals and high-ranking intelligence officers. So he's clearly a strategic and a rational thinker. Has the West underestimated Vladimir Putin?
No, I think it's kind of gone both ways. I mean, to a certain extent, we overestimated him and underestimated him at the same time. So the overestimation was basically the fact that he was able to annex South Ossetia and Abkhazia. The overestimation was that he was able to annex the Crimean Peninsula, and this made us think that he's some kind of a magic, strategic and tactical thinker. But then the underestimation came from the fact that he basically underestimated the resilience of Ukraine, the Ukrainian political leadership and the Ukrainian military. And that now is making him look weak. And of course, Putin has been at the helm of Russia for 20 years, albeit 4 years as prime minister when the president was Medvedev. So there's been sort of a back and forth of both underestimation and overestimation on both sides. But right now it is quite clear that Putin is not going to last forever.
Right, but so do you agree with Henry Kissinger's thesis that this war will only end if Russia exits Ukraine with a face-saving strategy?
No, I fully disagree with Henry Kissinger on this particular point, although I have a lot of respect for him. I also disagree with John Mersheimer, who has made a similar thesis, and all of those that come from the so-called realist school of international relations. I come from a country with 1,340 kilometers of border with Russia. And let me be clear on this. The only thing that Russia understands is power. You show any kind of a weakness, any kind of appeasement, and Russia and Putin will continue the types of international relations and violations of territorial integrity and sovereignty that we've seen before. So my answer is push back Putin back, and at the end of the day, make sure that he understands that he has lost the war and lost it big time.
Strategically speaking, for Russia, will the coast of Murmansk, where the Russian nuclear deterrence is stationed, continue to take precedence over the Baltic Sea, notwithstanding the latter's importance in the transport routes linking St. Petersburg to Kaliningrad?
Well, I'm not qualified enough from a military strategic point to give an opinion on that. But the truth is, of course, that it will be, and it is very difficult for Russia to be active on a multiple fronts, be that in Ukraine, Murmansk, or the Baltic Sea region. All I can say as a Finn is that Finnish NATO membership, and of course, the size of the Finnish military and the size of the Finnish Air Force will be a stabilizing factor in the Baltic Sea region.
Mm-hmm. Ever since their country invaded Ukraine, there's been a deafening silence from a group of Western-educated technocrats in Russia who are in charge of running Russia's economy. Why are Russian technocrats silent on the war?
Well, it depends on who you define as a technocrat. They are dependent agents in the system. And by that, I mean to say not intelligence agents, but economic and political. So the Russian system of governance is usually such that the leader, be that the Tsar or the president or the head of the Communist Party, is basically supreme. He doesn't make mistakes. And that means that he gives the right for governors to govern in regions up until the moment the governors make a mistake. Then he sacks them and he does it publicly. The same thing is true for the economy, where he uses oligarchs. They are allowed to plunder public goods up to the point when they make a mistake, whether it's Khodorkovsky or anywhere else for that matter. So in that sense, it's a very corrupt and hierarchical leadership system. And it's very difficult to voice your opinion, especially if you are dependent on the leader.
Right. But these technocrats seem to be successfully steering Russia's economy despite mounting Western sanctions. Do you think this can continue in the long run?
Well, of course not. And I'd kind of dispute your statement, because the Russian economy is detracting by 10%. And of course, you have some reserves to take care of that for a while. But the idea of sanctions is basically they are a long-term weapon. You can use it for a few short-term measures, but that's not the main point. The big point is that eventually Russia will be isolated politically, economically, financially, sports, culture, travel, and energy. And that will not only crumble the Russian economy, but it will also cause mayhem in Russia politically. That is a reality that we'll see in the coming years.
So you think that once Russia depletes its foreign currency reserves and perhaps its gold reserves, only then the real trouble, the real economic trouble will begin?
Yeah, sure thing. At the same time, I might add that never underestimate the capacity of Russians to sustain discomfort. They've been quite good at that throughout history. So I do think that we are in this for the long haul. I don't have a crystal ball which says that there will be a new Russian revolution, say a la 1917, 1918, or like 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. But we can already now see bubbling inside and certainly also outside the borders of Russia. Remember when the Soviet Union collapsed, it created 14, 15 independent states. We might be seeing some movement also inside the Russian Federation as such. So believe me, there will be unrest.
Right. How far and how long are Russian oligarchs willing to go in their support of President Putin?
Impossible to say, because I'm not a Russian oligarch. And it's probably going to depend a little bit on, their sort of resilience and capacity to move assets around. And
because these sanctions will also hit them hard, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are hitting them hard. It depends a little bit, of course, who you're talking about and which field. But sanctions are never something that happens overnight. Look, the European Union, for instance, has been tremendously good and swift and targeted in its sanctions. It now has 9 waves, and there will be more to come. So sanctions is a long-haul business. You just have to be patient.
Mm-hmm. The U.S. has been complaining about, Europe's failure to contribute to its own security policy ever since the 1960s, and of course much more with when Trump was in power. So do you see? I mean, we've already seen a number of European countries increase their military spending to go above and beyond the 2% of the GDP as stipulated by NATO. Can Europe take care of its own security without US support?
Well, I guess you're asking the wrong person, because I've come from a country where we have mandatory military service.
Finland is an outlier, definitely.
We have 900,000 men in reserves, 280,000 that can be mobilized at wartime. We have 62 F-18s, just bought 64 F-35s, and have one of the most sophisticated land-to-air and air-to-land missile defense systems. So we've certainly taken care of our side of the story. I guess you could say that, Europe has been perhaps a little bit naive on 2 accounts. Number one was to rely on Russian energy. Now that is being decoupled completely and happening, I think, surprisingly fast. And the second one was being reliant on American security. Here I'm more careful. I want American presence in Europe, just because of the mere fact that it is the most powerful military might in the world and we share the values. Now, does this mean that America will be in Europe forever? No, but I think it's very important that we get mutual benefits. I understand American concerns, especially as far as military spending is concerned. So it'll be 6 to 1, half a dozen of the other.
Right, but even the EU hasn't been on the same page when it comes to defense and spending. There have been a number of outliers, such as France, calling for strategic autonomy.
Yeah, I mean, as long as strategic autonomy, basically means that in some cases we can act ourselves. I think the world right now, we're not seeing deglobalization totally, but we're seeing a regionalization of globalization. And if strategic autonomy is about some military activity, I'm okay with it. But if strategic autonomy is about protectionism, then I feel a little bit uncomfortable. So you always have to find a balance on this. And we, of course, understand and know that France has always been a little bit lukewarm to American presence and to NATO. But fortunately, the European Union has 27 member states. 26 of them probably disagree with France on this particular issue. And NATO has 30 member states, soon to have 32. So France's presence is super important. Strategic autonomy is important as well, but we shouldn't go the full mile on this one.
Right. So you are a proponent of NATO's expansion. NATO pretty much controls the entire coast from Finland all the way until Turkey and Turkey's border with Syria, except for a couple of countries in the Balkans, in the Western Balkans. There are ongoing debates on whether Bosnia, Serbia, Kosovo should join NATO. In the meantime, we have seen increased Russian and Chinese activity in this part of the region. How serious do you take the unfolding political crisis in the Western Balkans? And do you think it can perhaps have a spillover effect on EU/NATO member states?
Well, I've always considered the Western Balkans to be strategically one of the most important, if not the most important area in Europe. And that's why I've always been a strong proponent, not only of peace after the wars in former Yugoslavia, but also of EU membership for the countries in question. I fully understand that there are many issues that have to be ironed out, not least, say, between Serbia and Kosovo. But I think we're now facing a new geopolitical reality. We're also facing a new European security structure. And for me, that security structure is, as I said earlier, on one side, Russia isolated, and on the other side, 44 European states. So I believe that all European states in the long run who want to become members of the EU, who want to become members of NATO, should be allowed that prerogative. Of course, I understand that it will take time. Of course, I'm concerned about the situation in the Western Balkans. Therefore, we need to cooperate and continue the dialogue for as long as it is necessary.
Right. Professor Stubb, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Very interesting insights you shared with us. Thank you once again for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot for having me.
Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?